Hey guys, welcome back to yet another video. Today I will be talking about the HBO miniseries Watchmen, episode 8, entitled A God Walks into a Bar. As usual for these episodes, I will not be alone. I will be joined by my good friend Matt Crandall. Welcome back, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
This episode is an episode that, if you're a Watchmen fan like we are, we've been waiting for since episode one, because in this episode, we finally get to see the guy in Watchmen. And the guy in Watchmen is obviously Dr. Manhattan. So, this episode starts off with just basically Dr. Manhattan walking into a bar, meeting Angela. Um, uh, at the start of their relationship. Now, a lot of things happen in this episode, but for the most part, this entire episode is framed with Dr. Manhattan basically explaining to Angela when they first meet in the bar everything that is going to happen throughout the course of their relationship, and trying to convince Angela that he is Dr. Manhattan. So I'm not going to listen, I'm not going to go section by section, because this episode is just basically them talking into a bar, them talking in a bar, and then, cutting back to some of the things that Dr. Manhattan is explaining.
At the end of last episode, we found out that Cal was actually Dr. Manhattan and Angela pulled out his magic thing. And so we were trying to figure out how this all came to be. And this fills in all that gap. So we see how they met, how they fell in love, and it's all concurrent because Dr. Manhattan experiences time in a different way. But as it starts at the remnants of a Dr. Manhattan celebration where lots of people are cosplaying as Dr. Manhattan, and he enters a bar and sits down with Angela Abar. Um, and he just looks like a Dr. Manhattan groupie because he's wearing a Dr. Manhattan mask, and she doesn't believe that he's actually Dr. Manhattan, is interesting. But part of this episode feels very comic booky, where Manhattan is wearing the Manhattan mask for their entire conversation. He doesn't take it off. But then when we do have scenes where they're in other places, like the morgue, his head is always out of frame. And in a comic book, that's a way for them to cheat and not see like whether this is actually Dr. Manhattan or whatever. But it really actually started to bother me in the show when we're having like 3-minute long sequences where they're having a discussion back and forth, and we're looking at a dude with no head in the frame talk, because they had this weird conundrum where they wanted the actor who plays Cal to play Dr. Manhattan, but at that point in the timeline, he wouldn't know to look like Cal because he hadn't seen Cal's body yet, or whatever the logic was. So I kept getting frustrated that we spent long stretches of this episode with dialogue scenes where a dude's head is either not featured or we're looking through like a little hole of a mask to sort of get a read on someone. And it was a nice technique, but it felt so comic book, and they kept doing it, that by the time we finally do see Dr. Manhattan's face and when Cal is actually in it, I was like relieved, but it almost felt like we waited too long.
With that editorial decision by the director and Damon Lindelof of not showing Dr. Manhattan, or not showing the whale in this case, which is obviously, like I said, Dr. Manhattan. To me, it was a really, really nice. It was an interesting visual cue. But like you, as I was watching this episode in preparation for this discussion today, it annoyed the shit out of me, because I'm like, at this point, we know who Dr. Manhattan is, so just fucking show us Dr. Manhattan, because we know he's there.
Right.
I'm like, but also, I would just want to point out, I really, really liked the way that the actor who plays Cal slash Dr. Manhattan um changed his voice, and sort of he had a different voice inflection for Dr. Manhattan. I just really like the voice that he chose for Dr. Manhattan, because it's so calm, and it's got this interesting tone to it that I really enjoyed, which kind of made me upset when he decided to change the color of his skin because he changed his vocal patterns. I'm like, no, talk like you were talking for the first for the first 20 minutes. That was awesome. The other thing that I really liked about this entire exchange with Angela and Dr. Manhattan in the bar is that the way that Dr. Manhattan speaks to Angela, it really makes you believe that this guy is crazy because he says things to Angela who to her, this guy's crazy. He's just met me, so how could he know all this crazy shit about me? So I think that it I think that it shows us that it requires Angela to take a giant leap to believe that everything that this guy is saying to her right now is actually true. And I think that it takes a very special person to sit there and listen to all this because if it was anybody else, I think that they would have gotten up a long time ago. But for some reason, Angela just sits there and goes along with this amazing story that Dr. Manhattan tells her about their life together. So it's in my opinion, it's asking a lot of the Angela character to believe right off the bat.
Yeah, it is. And I think they do a great job with the dialogue of making the conversation interesting. And so we can understand why she doesn't get up and walk away because it is really dynamic and intriguing as we know that he's actually Manhattan, but as this, weird blue stranger lays all this stuff out for Angela. And I like as we see the boxes sort of get checked where he's like 20 minutes from now, you're going to tell me how your parents died. And then, 20 minutes from then she tells how their parents died. And then when she clocks that she did that 20 minutes into their conversation and wondering, would I have done that if he didn't say that at the start of the conversation? And there's lots of stuff as this episode goes on where it's like, would this have happened if I didn't accidentally do this thing that then causes this to happen? Did I cause this whole thing to happen by asking this one question that I shouldn't have asked? And I think that's really intriguing and interesting in like a philosophical, and time paradox kind of way. And I really just their conversation at the bar where Manhattan is laying out everything and filling in tons of questions that we had about the series, saying, I'm not on Mars. That's a fake version of me. I'm actually on this moon of Jupiter. And I went there and I created life. And then I created this castle. And we're like, oh shit, this is where Adrian Veidt is. And as he's explaining how he created life and who he based them on, and he said he grew them in the lake and pulled them out, and we're like, oh, that's the thing where Adrian Veidt harvests the clones, and this is all a planet moon that Manhattan has created. And he references, his friend, and so we realize that Manhattan's the one who put Veidt here and has created that whole environment, and we learn who the clones are and why they are through John's flashback. So I thought all of that was handled really well and fills in a ton of gaps that we had while still keeping the focus on Angela and Manhattan's relationship and how that's going to play out over the course of the episodes we've already seen.
I feel that this episode feels a little bit empty because I feel that they constructed an entire episode on two people talking, and if what they wrote didn't work, this episode would have fallen flat on its face. Luckily for them, it did work, but still, I feel that this episode needed other stuff in it that it didn't necessarily have. I don't know if I feel that way because I know where all the blocks were already, or when I first saw this episode, I'm struggling to remember how I felt at the time, but still, I kind of feel that this episode needed a little bit more to it for me to feel like, okay, this is the second to last episode. Here we go.
They tried to give us enough, but they were keeping it very low key and contained, and trying to give us information we would need for the finale, but doing it in a small, almost like when you read Watchmen, there are some like low key side scenes, and that's how most of this bar stuff is kind of framed as. But it's giving us important information along the way, and more important information starts to come out as it goes because we see how Manhattan became Cal, how they decided on this cover story of his accident, why Manhattan has a big gap that he can't view, even though he experiences time all the same way. How, you know, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And that's going to be like an important conversation going forward. The walking on water thing that's going to be very important later. That they sprinkle in all this stuff that on a first viewing you're like, okay, this is not like an action packed episode of this show. And I almost by the end of it, I'm like, let's just get going. Like this for a penultimate episode is very low key and kind of dense that I was happy that there was only one episode left. Like if there was still 3 episodes left, I would be like, Jesus Christ, I'd be pulling my hair out. But so I feel that in hindsight, when you watch it again, a lot of it gels better as part of the whole. But I remember when it aired, I really liked all the Dr. Manhattan stuff, but found the way that they chose to really pump the brakes on the forward momentum and slowly examine a lot more philosophical and fill in some small gaps. You really had to be patient with it. You got to give them enough rope that hopefully it's worth it.
This episode really takes the forward momentum that we've been going on for the past couple weeks and brings everything to a slow and sudden stop in the middle of the goddamn road. And I feel like, for example, I feel like all the stuff that happened with Angela and Dr. Manhattan out of the bar, like when it goes back to Cal waking up out of just getting when it goes back to Cal waking up after just getting his brain smashed in, and you see Dr. Manhattan rise up and basically wake up. All of that stuff, I would have moved over to episode 9. And I would have just focused on the bar, the flashbacks to see how Dr. Manhattan experiences time, and all of that stuff. I would have put all of that stuff in this episode exclusively. I would have even taken out the dumb Adrian. Well, it wasn't dumb because we needed it to happen. I would have taken out that thing with Adrian too, and I would have moved that to the beginning of episode 9 and then continue with the Angela stuff. So I would have completely isolated this episode to the bar and the flashbacks of John explaining their love story. If the episode would have been like that, it would have been a little bit better for me because I thought that those 2 scenes in there were kind of like, why just move those things to the finale?
It's probably just like I said, if we didn't have any of the action current pickup and find out when Angela's like, Cal, something's gone wrong, we got to do this thing, it's that moment that you told us about, I think a lot of people would have been frustrated that
Right.
you know we were moving so quickly forward and then we just have a 2-hander dialogue episode. So I understand why they included it. I don't think you're wrong that it might have been a better episode if we did bump some of that stuff out, but I know momentum wise going into the finale, HBO is probably like, you can't you got to have some sort of hook near the end that reminds people this is going somewhere and isn't just, you know, Watchmen fan fiction, Dr. Manhattan speaking slowly for 45 minutes.
When we finally got to see Dr. Manhattan in the full Dr. Manhattan garb and the actor in the blue makeup, I thought it looked pretty cool. But with that being said, I would have loved to seen him in his suit in the bar because like me and Matt have said earlier in this review, it was really, really fucking annoying that every time he was talking to Angela, all you would see was the side of his face or his hands. Why did they do that? It was so fucking annoying. I'm like, just show the guy in the suit.
In the bar, I was like, okay, I get it. But then when we're at the morgue and his head is just out of frame, I'm like, come on. Like, just figure out what this guy looked like before and just give it to us rather than teasing this. But it felt comic booky, but not in a good way for me.
What did you think of the scene when Dr. Manhattan goes to see Adrian Veidt, and Adrian is in his ice palace, looking at all these TVs. Really intrigued me that Dr. Manhattan would trust somebody who had tried to kill him at some point, because that would make me a little bit nervous. But again, I'm coming at it from a human point of view, and Dr. Manhattan's not. Dr. Manhattan was a human, but he's not one anymore, and he doesn't think like one of us.
Right.
So the fact that he would come to somebody who was jealous of him, and the fact that it would come to somebody who tried to kill him, also tells us what he thinks of Adrian and how much he kind of still respects him in that point of view.
Their whole sequence was really well done, and it shows us that even though Veidt had his plan that killed millions of people or whatever, Manhattan views it from a logical point, and he realizes that that plan was needed to help balance the scales, kind of thing. Because he's like, yeah, this guy did some stuff, but he actually saved the world in the process of doing that. So I think it's interesting that we see Manhattan not be emotional and being logical and looking at stuff in a way that we certainly wouldn't. And him and Veidt continuing to have a relationship after the events of Watchmen is interesting. And also Adrian Veidt being the guy who comes up with the means for Manhattan to step away from being Dr. Manhattan to be able to become Cal and you know, have this other life for a bit was an interesting twist that I didn't necessarily know that Veidt would be so involved in helping Manhattan go incognito. So I thought that was really interesting when we see all of that play out. And it answers a lot of our questions of how and why would Dr. Manhattan do this. And I think that they are finally starting to realize that, you know, the Veidt stuff has to go somewhere into the main story, and we need it to play out in a way that justifies spending so much time on it during these previous episodes. And now that it's weaving in with the Manhattan, we know that it's going to weave further with that whole Seventh K is trying to become Dr. Manhattan stuff and how that's important in the long run. So I enjoyed that we can finally start to see different strands that felt very separate start to be woven together, and that Veidt Manhattan sequence really starts to make that clear.
At this point, I mean, you and I have hinted at it in previous episodes that we've talked about in our discussion series here. But at this point, I'm thinking that, you know, the Seventh Cavalry might think that they have a plan about how to get Dr. Manhattan's powers, and in this episode, we see how they do it, which is kind of cool. But whatever they have and whatever they have in stored, I don't think is going to go the way they think it's going to go. Because we mentioned last week that Lady True knows that she knows a lot more than she is hinting at on the surface. So I think that she has some kind of dastardly plan that we're going to see here be revealed in the final episode when we get to it next week. But I really, really like that in a way Adrian kind of gets punished for his misdeeds of killing millions of people by basically being sent to a nice fancy prison by Dr. Manhattan. I don't know if that was his intention when he built it, when he sent Adrian there, but to me it feels like Dr. Manhattan sort of viewed it from a logical point, like you said, but he kind of punished Adrian by sending him there. Do you think that he intentionally was trying to do that, or do you think that he wanted to send his friend to a peaceful place where he would be appreciated?
I think it was a bit of both, because I think he realized you need to get Veidt off the board or he might cause too much trouble. But also, as we learn, that when Manhattan brought the castle and created the life on there, it's because it's a place that reminds him of a time where he felt at peace and it is like his happy place. So he wouldn't necessarily view it as a prison for Veidt, but obviously that's how Veidt views it now because he's been there so long and he's trapped and he's sick of twiddling his thumbs and wants to get on with it and, do something bigger. So I thought that was really interesting that, yeah, we still aren't quite sure if Manhattan did it knowing that it was like a prison exile or if he did it just to kind of remove Adrian from the equation so that while he is off the board himself as Cal, this guy's not going to do anything to fuck up humanity.
Also, the lovely thing that I love about the Adrian Veidt and Dr. Manhattan scene in the, in his fortress in the middle of the Atlantic, is he basically says to Dr. Manhattan, "I saved humanity and nobody knows. I want some fucking acknowledgement." So it made me really happy that Adrian Veidt still sees his awful, awful deed as something that he had to do and something that was necessary. In that way, I find that he is a little bit more comic accurate than the movie version was, because the movie version kind of did what he did, but the movie version, at least from what I can remember, acknowledged that what he was doing was wrong, but he had to do it. This version doesn't really seem to give a shit. Right. This version doesn't seem to understand that although he saved humanity, what he did was fucked up. And what he did was wrong. And if anybody knew what he did, they would lock him up and throw away the key.
Yeah.
Also, I really like that in this scene, another thing that we are shown is that Adrian feels the need to remind everybody about his grand plan. So what does he do? He drops little tiny squids on the earth. So I love that we get that sort of Easter egg picked up from episode 1 when Angela is driving Topher back from school because he just smacked a racist kid in the face, and then you see the baby squids come down, and now we understand where those things come from.
Yeah.
But what do you think about Adrian's need to get acknowledged and need to be thanked for his appalling behavior?
Right. Well, and that's a, narcissistic kind of trait where if you need the validation of other people, I understand it to an extent, but like you can't have this evil plan and then think people are going to congratulate you and thank you. So it shows his skewed version of reality and how he's kind of operating, that he would think that even after doing this horrible thing that he thinks is the right thing, that he would expect praise and to be cheered on for having saved humanity when most people wouldn't view it that way.
Right. One of the last things that Dr. Manhattan does, and this is one of my favorite parts of the episode, if you take out all the amazing conversation that happens in the bar. One of the last things that Dr. Manhattan does as Dr. Manhattan, before Angela puts a thing in his head that will cause him to forget everything and basically forget who he is he goes and he tracks down Will. And at this point, Will is living in the apartment building that was bequeathed to him by Metropolis, his lover. So Dr. Manhattan goes and he meets Will and he says, I would like us to go into an accord and I need your help. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to go I would like you to eventually go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And I would like you to sort of try to strike up a relationship with this person called Angela Abar. And Will goes, "Who's Angela Abar?" And he goes, she's your granddaughter, right? Right. And then Dr. Manhattan says something very, very interesting, because at that point, he's talking to Will, and the director does something very, very interesting. So as that conversation is going on, in the present day, Dr. Manhattan is having a conversation with Angela by the pool, and Angela sort of puts together two and two and says, "Wait a minute, am I the one that ends up telling my grandfather that Jed was a member of the Seventh Cavalry, and am I the one that told him that he had a clan robe in his closet?" And then the camera switches back to Dr. Manhattan 10 years earlier, telling Will about this guy called Judd Crawford. And I love that thing, that everything that has happened so far probably ended up being Angela's fault, because she's the one that told Dr. Manhattan. She's the one that told Dr. Manhattan all this information, which he then told Will in the past. So I really, really love sort of that storytelling technique of the perfect circle, or the chicken or the egg thing. So what did you think about that storytelling sort of twist that they put in there at the very end, almost at the very end?
It happens after Cal has had his ring restored and he's back to Dr. Manhattan. His brain is kind of catching up on what happened. So he's kind of a little bit out of sorts. And he says to Angela, "Oh, I'm with your grandfather right now in that time," after he's realizing what has happened and how everything has gone off the rails. And she says, "Ask him how he knew Judd had a 7th Cavalry clan robe in his closet." And he asks him. And the guy goes, "I don't know who the fucking Judd Crawford is. What are you talking about?" And he goes, "Your grandfather has no idea who that is and doesn't know what we're talking about." And then she goes, "Well, then how did he know that he had this clan robe?" And then she's like, "Oh no." And we see the guy goes, "Well, I don't know anything about him, but you just told me he's got this thing in his closet. So now I know he's got this thing in his closet. And if I go to Tulsa, this is a bad guy." And she realizes that her asking Manhattan to ask the grandfather is the thing that maybe actually started this whole sequence of events from happening, because her grandfather had no idea about it until she asked Manhattan to ask him and planted the seed. So it brings us back to the chicken and the egg. What came first? Would this have all happened if Angela didn't ask that question, or is the only reason it's happening because Angela by the pool asked John to ask Will? And so that starts to collapse our brain in like a weird, Back to the Future, all these time travel rules sort of stuff happening, and the paradox and how the butterfly effect. But it's interesting because now they kind of taken a cheat where, like, we're going to ask, how did Will know all this stuff? And the answer is, well, he didn't. He just found out from Dr. Manhattan, who knew from Angela, because it all happened. Which, if you start to really like get into the weeds about it, might not make sense. But again, the way that time is explained in this as happening concurrently and not in like A to B sequence, it's all happening at once, is how they would kind of explain it. But it was fascinating to know that this moment of confusion and panic from Angela may have been the thing that really set everything into motion without her realizing that it would be.
They can do something like this because, and this is the only reason that they can do something like this and have it work, because, like Matt and I have said several times throughout this discussion, Dr. Manhattan doesn't view time like me and Matt do. Dr. Manhattan experiences everything all at once instead of in a straight line. He experiences everything like just drop that on the table like that, right? So with that storytelling crux of Dr. Manhattan, I think that's the only reason why something like having having Angela be the one that lets Will know about Judd Crawford in the first place would work. If Dr. Manhattan didn't have that character trait that he could experience everything all at once, it wouldn't work, and it would just not work, and it would be a giant hole in the storytelling, I thought.
It allows it to explain away all of the weird time stuff.
Is when Angela is having this conversation with Dr. Manhattan by the pool in present day. He's, trying to get his bearings, and all of a sudden he goes, I'm hungry. He zaps away into the kitchen. And this motherfucker goes to make pancakes. And I'm like, what is wrong with you, man?
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a minute. She has been trying to tell him for the past 5 or 6 minutes since she woke him up that Seventh Gate is coming to kill them. And this motherfucker wants to go walking on the pool. He wants to go have this conversation by the pool. And then he wants to go make pancakes. And when she walks in, something very, very interesting happens. John, opens the fridge with his telepathic powers. And Angela grabs the eggs in the middle of the air and goes, whoa, right? But before she does, John says, what? He says, watch the eggs. And I'm like, why would he say something like that? Then I'm reminded, back at the bar, Angela, at one point in the conversation, goes, oh, if you're really Dr. Manhattan, do some magic. And she, and he goes, well, I don't really want to do magic because if I do magic, I'll bring, attention to myself and then I'll just blow everything. But anyway, he ends up doing some like shift of hand and showing her his hands and then tapping on one of his closed hands, and he pops up an egg, right? And that sort of introduces the chicken or the egg example. But during them talking about it, Angela says, well, could you sort of bequeath your powers to someone else? And he says, well, I'm sure, well, I kind of just could, I could probably imbue my powers into an object. And that person who ate that object could essentially have my powers, but I don't know if that would work. So I feel that was put there for a very specific reason. I'm not very happy that it was put there for a very specific reason, but nonetheless.
Yeah, well, they keep going back to this egg thing, and as you said, they have a conversation where he talks about transference of Dr. Manhattan's powers, which we know this whole series has been ramping up because Seventh K think that they can somehow harness his powers and give it to themselves. And we call back to the eggs when they're in the kitchen, but also when he's walking on water on the pool, he explicitly says to her, this will be important later. And she's like, oh, okay. And it's like, what? And it's literally the writers calling out, like, this is something you need to pay attention to. Because she's like, do you really have to do this right now? Like, we got more important things. And he said, no, this is going to be important later, that you saw me walk on water. And that we're doing this before this egg stuff happens. So it lets us know, but also as the 7th K are coming, he's like, this is it. There's no way out. You can go out, but I'm basically going to be donezo from here. And she's saying, no, I'm sure we can find some way out of this. You're the most powerful being. And he's like, no, it has to happen this way. This is how it's all going to play out. So I thought that was really interesting. And they are ramping up the action while still giving us those small foreshadowing moments that will become important later by literally calling them out explicitly.
When Dr. Manhattan goes to talk to Angela in the bar, at one point he says, there was this one moment when I knew that I loved you. And that one moment happens in present day when Angela sort of doesn't want to accept the fact that this is it for them. They have no way out. Angela basically arms up and she goes outside to deal with the 7th K members who are across the street. And that whole sequence is really, really mesmerizing, but it's really, really sad because Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor have like the score that they chose for a scene is very, very great, but it's very, very somber. Mm-hmm. And as it happens, you see Angela killing a bunch of fools. You see John inside the house. And there's this moment when Angela commandeers one of the trucks and is about to get shot by one of the 7th K members. And that's like the hero moment of the episode when John comes out onto the field and just wastes a bunch of fools. So John is doing his thing. He's vaporizing everyone in sight. And if you notice, John stops killing everybody once he gets in front of one of the machines that Seventh K made to sort of transport him into that cage that they've been building. And even when I was watching the episode when it initially aired, I was like, "Why are you stopping right in front of the machine? Why are you stopping?" I'm like, but also, I'm like, why doesn't Angela tackle him? Because if she tackles him, I mean, granted, he could probably shoo her away in a second, but that wouldn't prevent her from trying, right? But I'm also like, dude, why did you stop directly in front of the thing that's gonna? But I'm like, but also I'm like, of course he would do that because he knows whatever is going to happen, he ends up in the same spot.
Right.
But I really appreciated that Damon Lindelof and the writers showed that moment of when Doctor Manhattan fell in love with Angela, because all of his other girlfriends that he has had leave him at the most critical point. Angela is the only one, from my recollection, that when shit hits the fan, Angela's the only one that didn't run. So I really appreciate that John understands that the only one that didn't, Angela not running, really made him understand that she really does love me, unlike my other girlfriends that I've had throughout my existence as Dr. Manhattan.
He said, there is a moment where I've realized that I'm in love with you. And when she finds out that it's now, she's like, oh, it took you 10 years. Like, this is kind of insulting, but it's a nice moment. And they knew even from that meeting in the bar, he's like, we're together for this long. And then there's a tragic event. There's a tragic night. But we're happy until then. And so it's interesting to watch all of that play out and to see that it's her strength in the adversity moment that kind of solidifies it for him. And as you say, she doesn't run. She's willing to do whatever, even if it is the end of both of them. And in the moment where he gets zapped, it's because he knows that it's inevitable. Even if Angela were to save him momentarily, like something else is going to happen. This is how things were destined to play out, because whatever happened happened. It's all the way the time works in this, that he knows it's futile. He's seen all of the different ways it's going to go down. It's going to go down the same no matter what. So he doesn't resist it. But knowing that she was willing to put everything on the line to try and change it is enough. That's the key thing that keeps them solidified, even as he gets zapped and she's kind of left to fend for herself in that horrifying Seventh K moment.
As we pick up with the Adrian Veidt story, where he is on Europa, and we know that now because John says, I built this thing and I sent Adrian Veidt there. But after Adrian's trial, they decide to put him up on like this stake sort of thing and throw tomatoes at his face, which I love. By the way, I thought that was great. I just love seeing Adrian Veidt being pelted with tomatoes. It's just fine to me. But anyway, he ends up being jailed, and as habit, um, these clones keep bringing him anniversary cakes for every year that he's been there. And the anniversary cake that he gets given to him while he's in jail is by the game warden. Now, the game warden is basically like the head clone guy. And the game warden is the one with the mask, and he was the guy on the horse that shot him way back in episode 1, and we had no idea who the fuck he was. Anyway, it turns out that the game warden is the original clone that John made. Because originally John made two clones. He made a man and a woman. And the man that he made is the game warden. So I really, really like that the game warden happened to be the first ever male clone that John made back in the day. And I found that really, really fascinating. Also, what Adrian finds in the cake with the shoehorn is really cool, because once he finds the shoehorn, he understands that the shoehorn means that the end game is near and it's time for him to, make his grand entrance again, or do whatever he's gonna do with that. Mostly, I thought that scene should have been ported over to the finale, but nonetheless, I thought that it was really interesting.
We wrap up with the Angela Manhattan stuff. We watch 2 minutes of credits, and then we have 3 minutes of episode left to go after the credits. That's all this
Yeah,
Vite stuff. So it's
yeah.
put on there as an afterthought, saying like, this is something we need you to know before the finale, but it wouldn't have fit into the flow of the episode because we didn't want to stop everything dead in its tracks. So it is an interesting reminder now that we know the context of Europa, the clones, how that all came about, and then seeing Vite get the cake and realize that, like, we're in the end game now, was kind of fascinating and makes you a little bit more interested to see how that's going to wind up in episode 9. But the tomatoes in the face and all that stuff is unpleasant. So it was like I've sat through the credits and then I'm watching these really unpleasant scenes that are kind of off-putting. And I was glad that they were after the credits and not the actual end of the episode, because the end of the episode is so exciting. And this is kind of like I don't like it, but I know that it's the peas and carrots we need before we get to the next episode where we're going to get the meat.
Because the ending of this episode is very, very dramatic and it's very emotional when we see Doctor Manhattan being pulled into it's awful. He basically gets pulled into a black hole and he gets transported. I'm really excited to see what the final hour of the show is going to be. I don't know if they are going to be able to bring it home in I don't know if they're going to be able to land the ship in the way that I want them to, but I'm very, very interested to see how this show is going to ultimately wrap up and conclude. Going into the final episode, is there anything that you're looking forward to or hoping that might happen?
Um, Not necessarily. I think that at this point, I'm exhausted from how much stuff is in this show, that I honestly think if it was any longer than 9 episodes, it would be too much. So I'm like relieved. I'm relieved, and it sounds bad because I do like the show and I've enjoyed rewatching it, but I'm like so glad that it's over. I'm so glad we only got one left and that we can wrap this up, because it's an exhausting, like, you enjoy it, but it's like being put through the ringer as you watch this whole mini series play out, because it's got so much going on, so many themes and ideas that are deep and thoughtful, but like, it's not a kick your feet up, pop some popcorn kind of show. So going into the finale, I'm hoping that they can land the plane in a satisfying way and make some of the awful stuff that we have seen feel necessary, feel like every moment was not wasted and that everything led to the finale and was important. Because at 9 episodes, especially the way we're trained to watch TV now, where a lot of seasons are 6, 8, or 10, 9 feels like just such a weird number that I'm like, I hope that all of this feels like every episode was earned and that everything needed to play out this exact way. And we couldn't have done it in 8 and we padded to get it to 9, or we couldn't have done it in 10, but we cut stuff to get it down. So I'm just hoping that they can land the plane. And as much as I remember, I haven't watched this since it actually aired 4 years ago. So I own it on Blu-ray, but I've never revisited it since it aired. So I'm interested to see if I feel satisfied at the end like I did the first time or not, because I have enjoyed this, but I'm tired.
Matt, if the folks at home want to reach out to you to talk Watchmen or to talk about anything else that you do, what would be the best place for them to do that on?
On Twitter at Matt Crandall. And if you like what you see here, you can listen to our podcast, Radio 815, where we talk about J.J. Abrams stuff, Felicity, Alias, Lost, Fringe, or if you're just looking for some general movie discussions, on YouTube at Armchair Directors.
If you want to chat with me about anything that I do, the best place to catch me would be on Twitter. I'm at Creek Fanatic 88. But until next time, we have one more episode to go, guys. So with that, I will simply say thank you for watching, and I'll see you when I see you.
So much happened here, and so much is about to.